for Tonight with Vincent Browne.
The commemoration of the 1916 Easter Rebellion has been very impressive in very many ways, but at the heart of the concept of what has been called an inclusive commemoration, that is commemorating not just the rebellion itself, but the opposition to the rebellion, is there not a huge contradiction here? Tonight we explore that contradiction. Also tonight we talk about the Lanigan's Ball that passes for the negotiations in Leinster House for a new government. With us are Donna Davis, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Trinity College Dublin, Donna Cooney, who is grandniece of Elizabeth O'Farrell. There's some controversy over that. The woman, Elizabeth O'Farrell, was the woman who accompanied Patrick Pearse when he surrendered, really, outside the GPO. And she's in some of the photographs of Patrick Pearse surrendering, but she's airbrushed out of some of the other paragraphs. And also with us is Mary McAuliffe, also of UCD. If you'd like to comment on the program, you can text us at 53131 and place the word Tonight before a comment. Send us a tweet at #B or email us at tonight@tv3.ie. Before we get into the discussion about the 1916 issues, what do you think of what's going on in the government 33 days after an election, no sign of a new government, and Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have not yet talked together? What do you make of all this?
It's, there's a bit of irony that at the commemoration, the centenary of the 1916 Rising, we don't even have a government. I think some people were joking a couple of weeks ago that maybe for the 1916 centenary we wouldn't have a government, and actually it's come true. They seem to have weathered it pretty well, though, the government. I mean, everything seems to have gone pretty well with the commemorations.
The
acting government.
They're caretakers.
Yes, exactly.
Funny that they targeted carers in their public expenditure cuts. They haven't been targeted themselves so far. What do you make of all this carry on?
I think it's a shame. It's anti-democratic. I mean, people came out and they voted, and they should put together a government. I think we need changes. That actually we should have a government should last the same way as local government for 5 years. And if people knew beforehand that who they might make them think about, when they're voting, that who they vote for from former government, and that government would last then for the term of 5 years, that we wouldn't go to the electorate again, and that they would have to, really sit down together and negotiate and come up with
What do you hope happens?
Well, I think the two main parties who will make a majority if they form a coalition need to talk to each other. This sort of little waltz they're doing around each other is not at all pleasant to watch. The fact that they're talking to the independents and then they're not talking to them. At this stage, I think they're really, the commemorations are over now. They need to sit down and start thrashing out whether they can make it or not.
Is that they're trying to manoeuvre a situation whereby they will get more, that either Enda Kenny or Micheál Martin will get more votes for Taoiseach. And if Micheál Martin gets more votes for Taoiseach, he will claim that he's the one entitled to form a minority government. And if he fails, then Enda Kenny will. But I assume that that's what's going on. But
I would think so, yeah. They're manoeuvring for position. While at the same time, the homeless crisis goes on, carers are getting cut back, and nobody's doing, the acting government isn't capable of doing anything. I've been making a point for some time that our politics is really just about which crowd gets the ministerial jobs. That's what it's all about. And if you have focus groups and research material and all that to find out what do you need to tell the electorate for them to elect this crowd or that crowd into the ministerial job. It's not about policies at all. Policies are just instruments for getting the jobs. Do you think that's too cynical? No, I don't think so. I think there is a certain cynicism that is prevalent among the electorate at the moment about, who's getting the state car or the half car. in their constituency. And perhaps that's something we need to look at in terms of our clientelist system. You know,
and they don't seem to even have the expertise in the area that they end up being minister for. It's not as if they had that portfolio for beforehand, and that they've been a spokesperson in their party for many years and know about it. They seem to be just handed a ministerial thing, depending on, you know, whether you're a favourite of
it's
the
amazing.
Taoiseach.
Andy Kenny around the country never ran anything other than an infant's class in Castlebar before he became a TD. Micheál Martin was a teacher as well. He never ran anything before he ran a department, and the rest of them are all the same. And we wonder why it's a screw up. And anyway.
Well, you take example from the Canadian government, the new one with Justin Trudeau. He has appointed ministers who have expertise in the area in which they are holding ministerial briefs.
They're not members of Parliament, I assume.
Some of them are, and he has gender quota as well.
Ministers cannot be members of Parliament as well, which gives an opportunity to appoint people. They're executives. They're only executives. They're not policymakers. But anyway, that's the way we go.
That might be almost more worrying, the idea that an Irish government could appoint some of their friends to be ministers if they weren't TDs or members of Parliament, considering certain issues around state appointments.
Most of them don't have any friends. So what are you on about?
we need serious...
People go on about cronies.
I meant
cronies. Right? They don't have any cronies. Anyway, we're going to take a break now, and we get into talking about the contradiction at the heart of our commemoration of what happened in 1916. Tonight we're going to talk about the commemoration of the 1916 Easter Rebellion. I think that what has been done by RT particularly has been really impressive. I think they've done a great job being critical of RT in many respects in the past, but I think they've done a great job over the last several weeks or indeed months. But also the organisation of the commemorations around the country, I think, has been great, and the people involved in that deserve a great deal of praise. But I sort of wonder, what is it that we're commemorating? If we're commemorating the Easter Rebellion, how can we commemorate those who took part in the rebellion and at the same time commemorate those who opposed the rebellion and indeed executed some of the people who were involved in the rebellion? And I think there's a contradiction there, for instance, in the American American commemoration of the American War of American Revolution. They don't commemorate the British who tried to stop the American getting independence, and it seems to me that there's a bit of a contradiction here. In any event, with us this evening to talk about this are Donna Davis, who's I called an assistant professor, but in fact he's a thing called an adjunct professor. What's an adjunct professor?
Good question. It's
what do you mean? You must know. You're an adjunct professor.
Yeah. So Trinity just changed their system a couple of years ago. Everybody used to be called lecturers or junior lecturers or senior lecturers or whatever, and now everybody's professors or assistant professors or associate professors or adjunct professors or whatever. Yeah.
God, I'd love to be an adjunct professor. But that was one thing I always wanted to be, is adjunct professor. In any event, we also have with us Donna Cooney, who's great-grandniece of Elizabeth O'Farrell, who was liaised a lot with Patrick Pearse during the course of the Easter Rising, and she was with him when he surrendered to the British officer just outside the DPO, and she's in a photograph, barely seen in the photograph, with him in that, and in some of the photographs she's been airbrushed out. And also with us Mary McAuliffe, a historian at University College Dublin. If you'd like to comment on the programme, you can text us at 53131, place the word tonight before a comment, send us a tweet at #B or email us at tonight@tv3.ie. OK, let's talk first about what is it that we were commemorating. Were we commemorating the event itself, or were we commemorating what the people who took part in the Rising stood for, or what was it? What did you understand we were commemorating?
I think there's a huge ambiguity around this question of what we're commemorating. As you know what I think about this, I guess. I wrote about this in the Examiner yesterday, but I think the ambiguity is that there's at least two different things that people are commemorating. Because on the one hand, some people view the 1916 Rising as the kind of foundational moment for this state that we have now. And I guess that would be the view of the state and, for want of a better term, the establishment view. But then for some other people, I don't think that's what they think at all. Some people view what happened in 1916 as the start of an unfinished revolution, and they consider that this state that we have today is not the culmination of that vision of the rebels of 1916. I think both of those two different visions of what we're commemorating have their own big contradictions, because if you take the view that 1916 was the foundational moment of this state, then that's actually quite hard to argue that it is, because this is actually, we're still in the same state that was set up in 1922 that was so contentious at the time that many of the people who were still around from the 1916 Rising ended up having a civil war over this, right? And many of those people in 1916, if we had the chance to consult them, they would probably repudiate this state and the idea that this state is the culmination of their vision.
OK, Mary, what do you think?
I wouldn't agree with that, actually. I think what we're commemorating in 1916 has a multiplicity of meanings, not just two different ones. And certainly there's a multiplicity of unfinished revolutions. For me, as a historian of gender, one of the revolutions going on at the time, of course, was women and women's revolution. And that's an unfinished revolution that still continues to this day. There's also class issues and socialism and trade unionism and those who were participating in 1916 for a workers' republic. Are they commemorating something that never actually came off, and we consider that an unfinished revolution? So I think what we're commemorating is something that doesn't have one particular meaning. I think it has a lot of meanings for a lot of different people. Yes, for the state, 1916, although the state is very suspect on this, it doesn't really want to see 1916 as the beginning point of its foundation. It would prefer to see, I would say, the 1919 government or indeed what happened after the Anglo-Irish Treaty. For those who see the 26 counties as an unfinished revolution, obviously that's the beginning of a revolution that continues to this day. So the commemorations that happened on Sunday was a commemoration of the people who decided to go out and break the link with Britain, to break imperial control of Ireland. Whether they failed or whether they succeeded is moot and that moment of commemoration. And certainly if we look at the first commemoration in 1917, which was actually carried out by the women mainly. It was commemorating that. That's what they were commemorating, what those people had done and what they had tried to do.
They were commemorating what in 1917?
They were commemorating what the men and women of 1916 had tried to do and failed to do. And they were using that commemoration to I suppose, reignite or continue on that flame of nationalism.
But
Which
we've had that flame of nationalism. That flame of nationalism survived.
It does, yeah, into the War of Independence.
That's right, and onwards. And that's why we have Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael around still, because of nationalism.
Well, of course, there's different interpretations of that.
Yeah, but it's because something called nationalism has survived that we have this thing going on over that time. What do you think, Donna?
Well, I think the commemoration was a commemoration, as Mary says, of those that women and men that fought for Irish freedom. We were part of an empire, and we inspired, I think, around the world, the breaking down of the empire. The taxi driver that took me here tonight said, "I'm from India," and he said, "You inspired our country." You know, so we what they did then started the end of the empire. The argument is the social things that they wanted, the equality that they wanted hasn't come through. I mean, I think nationalism is not really what was in question. Is the social aspirations that they had. They saw that there was poverty. We had the highest infant mortality rate in Europe. We had people were working at slave pay at the time, and they wanted to improve people's livelihood, and they saw having autonomy and having their own republic was the way to go, and that's what they fought for.
They were wrong, though, weren't they?
They weren't wrong because they did achieve. It is better than it was back then, but it's not. They haven't achieved fully,
No. And that had we remained as part of the United Kingdom, the welfare of the mass of people would have been far better. We'd been far better off than we were as an independent state. The first government was a cruel, vicious government, worse than the one that's now just gone out of office. And Fianna Fáil governments were a good deal better in the 1930s. They then became cruel and vicious themselves.
But you see, that is part of the counter-revolution that happened. That was not the revolution that was started in 1916. That was the most conservative of revolutionaries become the government of the Irish Free State. And there's no denying that they retreat from that position that was proclaimed in the 1916 proclamation of full and equal citizenship and equal rights and equal opportunities. You can see that in the legislation passed to push women out of the workplace.
Yeah.
You can see it in the cuts to the old age pension. You can see it in all sorts of different ways that counter-revolution, you could say, in lots of ways, betrayed what was proclaimed in 1916. So the ideologies of the men and women of 1916 doesn't actually last very long.
Yeah, the ownership of property went into the Constitution rather than...
I mean, I think this question of revolution and counter-revolution is, it's an interesting one, but it's often not clear what we really mean by the Irish Revolution or the Irish counter-revolution. Usually people don't really define these terms. That's one way to look at what happened. Another way to look at what happened is that actually the nationalist and Republican movement of the 1916 to 1921 or 22 or 23 period was a very mixed bag. And it included socialists, it included very conservative Catholics and so on. And so you could look at it as a revolution and counter-revolution, or you can say that it was just a very mixed bag and, one particular vision won out. And we saw the very conservative governments of the early Free State. But there's another important...
Connolly was executed. I mean, the women weren't listened to, and the women, I suppose, you might have called them radical, but all they wanted is that we had a country of equals, and that, and that people would have the opportunity in order to have...
But the people themselves, when the people themselves got an opportunity to vote, they voted for a people of unequals. That's what's been the way it is. People voted Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, who had really no commitment to the idea of radical equality at all, ever since. So that's the mass of the people. Don't blame the leaders and all that. The mass of the people didn't want it.
This is true. I mean, again, these were very chaotic circumstances in which the early elections took place, and it was war and it was violence and so on. But there's another point. I mean, you said that if we'd stayed within the UK, we would have been better off. And you can argue that point, right? Because you can argue that we would have had the NHS and all this stuff.
No, not just that. Not just that. The welfare state had begun to emerge in the Lord George budget of 1910 or 1912 or whatever. And the welfare state had begun to grow and grew significantly in Britain in the 1920s. Now, we were outside, we benefited from the old age pension, for instance, which came into play before we got independence. But we didn't benefit. We missed out on a lot of the other benefits that happened in Britain in the 1920s and onwards. And I remember Gareth Fitzgerald, I think he was conflicted about the 1916 Rising because he instinctively didn't approve of elites taking actions on their own, supposedly on the part of the people, or taking violent action. But the conflict arose from the fact that both his parents took part in the Rising.
But
Gareth
Fitzgerald always wanted us to join NATO and everything as well.
Just a minute. Gareth was to argue that had the 1916 Rising have happened, the mass of the people wouldn't have opted for independence at all, because it would have been the movement towards independence would have been delayed, and by that time people wouldn't have opted out of the welfare state that had grown significantly in the 1920s.
I don't think you can argue about that. I think if you look at the material that's coming to the surface now through the newly released pensions files and the witness statements, you can see, number one, this wasn't an elite movement per se. That there were quite a number of working class people, of women, of people outside the elites who were who ideologically committed to the idea of freedom. What's
this thing?
Well, the
freedom?
Irish Citizen Army.
Well, what is this thing, freedom?
The idea that there would be a government run by the people, for the people, sitting in Dublin, that would make the laws and governance for the country.
That's freedom.
That's freedom in a democratic
people who
sense.
lived in utter misery for decades afterwards. Freedom didn't mean much to the millions of people who left Ireland in the period after independence.
Nor did being part of the United Kingdom mean much in the 19th century when famine hit.
That's right.
And obviously millions left then, you know.
That's right.
And it took decades and decades and decades of violence to get the land Act.
The mass of people would have been better off in many ways. I'm making a case now against Irish independence, but I think there's a case for it too. But the mass of the people would have been better off had we remained part of the United Kingdom.
Well, we ended up with the best maternity system, and I suppose you have people like Kathleen Lynn and those that then encouraged a lot of the women then to go back and do their midwifery and to get involved in healthcare. We ended up from having sort of the highest infant mortality to having the best, you know, in terms of maternity care and in terms of you know, so I think that, you know, you could see that regressing now again.
Okay.
But we do.
I think in any post-colonial country you're going to have difficulty around economics because, of course, any colonised country is going to be stripped of its resources. Plus the fact that the border happening removed the one industrialised part of the country. That was never part of the plan. That did happen. So we can say that the people would have chosen to stay within the United Kingdom. They didn't have the foreknowledge of what was to come about, which was a very poor country.
Wouldn't need foreknowledge at the end of the 1920s, for instance, because of the advances that had occurred in the 1920s and the welfare state. People were radically better off in Britain than they were in Ireland. The mass of people were significantly better off in Britain than they were in Ireland because of the welfare state reforms that were introduced
Vincent,
in the 1920s.
Can I make a point? I mean, this is, I think it's very useful to talk about counterfactual history, but it's also an extremely complex question. What would have happened if Ireland had stayed in the UK?
What if stuff and so on.
Yeah, but I mean, it's worth doing it, but it is very complex. And you know, there are also other things to bear in mind, right? Of course, yes, you can say we would have had the NHS and so on. That's assuming that Ireland would have been run like the rest of the UK, which is debatable, because Ireland, up until independence, was certainly not run like the rest of the UK. That's just one thing.
Well, we had the same welfare entitlements.
Okay, but Ireland was run in a very strange colonial way from Dublin Castle. Another thing is that if we'd stayed within the UK, we would have taken full part in World War II. So if you're just looking at it in terms of how many people died and so on, a lot of Irish people would have died if we'd stayed in the UK
But I just want to challenge also this idea of freedom, that there was freedom for an elite that became the rulers of the new state. But for the mass of the people, it meant nothing. And I think that we got to take that into account as well.
Oh, I think there's no denying that. That's what happened. Once the Irish Free State was put in place, what you got was the replacement of one elite with another elite with a different accent, with our accents. And of course, the one big institution that fills a vacuum of power is the Catholic Church. So you get that state and church elite coming together to create what is a very, for lots of people, dark economic theocracy, which condemns a lot of people to bad experiences, women into Magdalene laundries, young poor people into industrial schools, what Mannix Flynn calls the criminalisation of poverty and female sexuality. All those sort of things in that state were terrible, and things we're still looking back on and thinking about and exploring as the dark underbelly of Irish society. But I would still argue that the fact that we broke the link with England was very much part and parcel of what people were aiming towards since the mid-19th century.
But what was the point of it?
Well, the point is, because the point is your identity. You want to feel like you're Irish. It's part of your I suppose it's part of, they look at, why did people get out, in their masses, to the commemorations that happened this weekend? Why did people feel that they wanted to be part of all that? And they were ordinary people. They were people that have been through the recession that we've been. And the people that were most out there, celebrating and commemorating it are those that you could say have probably fared haven't fared off the best. It's because, it inspires people, and that they can see the visions that they had back then, that they haven't been seen all the way through, but they know that the people that fought back in 1916 had something that beyond their own lifetimes, that they saw, the betterment of Irish people. And they want to feel Irish. They want to feel it's part of their identity,
Welsh people did have felt Welsh. The Welsh language survived in a way that the Irish language didn't survive. Scottish people have very strong sense of identity, and both Welsh and Scottish people still within the UK. But do you think
then the whole empire should have survived? I mean, India, the whole empire...
No, we're not talking about the empire, we're talking about the United Kingdom. We're talking about the United Kingdom.
Can I say something
about that? But they were part of an empire,
No, we're not. We're talking about the United Kingdom. And that within the United Kingdom there were different, England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland.
But we weren't part of the United Kingdom, we were part of an empire.
They retained a very strong identity. They retained their language, which we didn't.
We were a separate island.
What?
We were a separate island that had been environment. Yeah, but we were part of the empire as well.
We were part of the United Kingdom.
We were part of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, I know. But
Sorry,
if you know, why do you deny it?
About freedom.
Go on, yeah.
So you can say, I mean, this talk of freedom can get very vague.
Neither king nor Kaiser.
This talk about freedom can get very vague and airy-fairy. From a materialist point of view, you could say that the South or the 26 counties got political freedom in the sense of political independence. But, from a materialist point of view, it wasn't much to write home about. But we have to talk about the North in this as well, right? Because the North is part of this island too, and the North is the 6 counties are part of the 1916 vision of an Irish Republic. And what people in the North got, or at least nationalists or Catholics in the North, was not a quasi-freedom like people in the South got. They got less than freedom. They got minus freedom because they ended up in a worse situation, a far worse situation than they'd already been in.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you that. But that case was over. By 1916, it was obvious that there wasn't going to be a united Ireland. And because although the Home Rule Act had been passed in 1914, the British political establishment knew it won't work. And they had capitulated to the coup d'etat that occurred in 1912, wasn't it? When the Loyalists threatened violence, and the British Army in Ireland said they wouldn't oppose the Loyalists using violence. So this was a capitulation. They won. That was the rebellion that was succeeded, and that won. And an interesting thing about all that, I think, is that people kept on saying, and keep on saying to this day, that you can't force 1 million Protestants into United Ireland, 1 million Unionists or Nationalists into United Ireland. But they had no difficulty in forcing 500,000 Catholics into a sectarian state in Northern Ireland.
Of course,
and
yeah.
The British government and the Irish government throughout all those years couldn't care less about it.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I mean, I think it's important to remember that up until maybe not 1916, but not long before 1916, around 1913, the British government was still considering imposing home rule on Ulster as well, by force. There was a point when they were seriously considering doing this.
Yeah,
but then it's true that
shortly after the passing of the Home Rule Bill, they'd given up. There's a brilliant book on it written by Ronan Fanning, The Fatal Path, and it brilliantly shows
that
how
they
were never going to impose
it wasn't going to work.
Yeah, but there's a difference between... there is a difference, which comes back to your thing about staying in the UK or not. There's a difference between hard partition, in the sense of what we got, where you've actually got 2 different states, and the partition that was on the table prior to 1916 and prior to 1920, when there was still some kind of prospect of home rule. That would have probably been a soft partition, for want of a better term, with 2 different parliaments.
Virtually meaningless.
Even John Redmond at that stage had realised that, just before he died, he had realised that the home rule he had expected was never going to be gained and made speeches in the House of Commons about that. That he realised that the British government were not going to come through on what had been passed.
There was only the pretence there in order to get people to join in the First World War. I mean, that pretence was put out so that, you know, people would, if you join up and you fight in the First World War, we're going to give it to you after. But I mean, that's what the people that fought in 1916 knew it was never going to, and they had no option but to revolt.
There is an advantage in living in a small state that has a sense of identity, and we do have a sense of have some control over our own affairs. But I'm not sure if that isn't a middle class thing, that we in the middle class are able to have some minor influence on what happens, but I'm not sure that it matters for the mass of people.
Well, there's an interesting historical irony there, because if you look at the independence movement of 1916 up to, you know, 1920, 21, 22, it was a cross-class alliance, there's no question about that, but you could probably say that the core of the IRA and Sinn Féin was fairly, let's say, upper working class to lower middle class, which has probably changed, because now actually, you know, republicanism in terms of how people think of republicanism today is probably more of a proletarian thing than it was in 19...
But the Irish Citizen Army
I'm
made
sorry,
up a big
we've got to go to a
faction,
break now, and after the break we'll get to preview tomorrow morning's newspapers, but we'll continue some of the discussion we've just been having. Join us then. We're joined by Alice Mary Higgins, a candidate for the Senate on the NUI panel, and Laura Harman, who is also a candidate for the Senate on the NUI panel. Let's start. Alice Mary, why do you want to be an NUI senator, this corrupt borough of the university's panels?
Well, what I think, first of all, is that the Seanad is a space where I can be making change, and I know that I'm going to be... it's a place where you've seen really good legislation come through, and one of the things that we've seen is that it's NUI senators particularly who have always championed the extension of the franchise. So it was Fergal Quinn and John Crown, for example, who put forward legislation to give a universal vote for the Seanad, and I'll be carrying that forward.
Nothing happened.
Why would it not happen? It went through committee stage. It was just blocked by government.
God,
it's been constitutionally tested. They put forward legislation.
It got to the committee stage.
And it was agreed by all parties, but then it was blocked by the government after the failure of their referendum for abolition. So we have basically legislation tested by the Constitution, which could be redeveloped and put through again.
Why didn't you think of standing for the Dáil rather than running for the
Because I've been working with the National Women's Council of Ireland, working with Older and Bolder. I've always been working with organisations with a national mandate. And for me, I want to be in a space where I'm able to discuss a full picture of national issues and pull from civil society and bring a kind of a civil society perspective in. And I think that's something which is badly needed if our legislation is really going to serve the public good and serve the people properly.
OK, why are you running for the Senate?
Well, I mean, I'm a new progressive voice for the Seanad. Some of my key issues that I want to work on would be education funding. I was president of USI last year, and I've seen how much pressure is on families trying to put people through college. I was at the teacher conferences during the week talking to them. You know, pay equalisation is a big issue. I suppose other areas that concern me is reform, and I think the biggest reform that we can make for the Seanad is to extend the franchise, because I think a lot of people...
To abolish the university seats would be a big reform. Abolish the thing that you're running for.
No, you could keep the university panel, but people...
No, you couldn't. You couldn't. This is an aberration. It's awful that we have that thing.
The government, the Manning report...
It's privileged that people who get third-level degrees alone can vote for people who don't. It's awful.
It should be one person, one vote.
One person, one vote, but what I'm saying is people could choose to vote on a panel of their choosing, and we could do that without a constitutional referendum. Last year I was president of USI. We registered over 30,000 new student voters.
Postal ballot. Have to be by postal ballot.
By postal ballot, yeah.
Okay.
I suppose another
imagine
big...
how many people would take part.
Another big reason why I'm running is gender equality. And I think, Mary McAuliffe put it well earlier when she said it's an unfinished revolution in this country. I think, we still have underrepresentation when it comes to politics, when it comes to women. Repeal of the 8th Amendment would be a big issue that I'd like to push if I got elected. And, I am worried, I suppose, with the current government formation talks that it hasn't really been on the agenda. And that is certainly something that I would be an advocate for as a senator.
I mean, I would chime in. I absolutely agree in terms of, I think we are in a space where we need to look at issues. The 8th Amendment needs to be back on the table, but also we saw today, and it actually didn't make the front pages of the papers, but it was out, that Impact were calling for childcare to be put back on the agenda. It was something that came up absolutely everywhere during the election and which has now vanished in terms of the issues that are being discussed. So if we're looking at gender equality, I think we're right, we need to look at repeal of the 8th Amendment. We also need to look at issues like care getting recognised and where that's going to feature.
Who will you be voting for, number 2?
I don't think it's a matter of... We've a lot of strong candidates. I will be voting for other progressive voices who share the same issues.
Number 2? Who will you be voting for number 2?
It's a secret ballot now. Do you know that?
Come on, who will you be voting? No, it's not
There's
that
a lot
secret,
of progressive candidates there, and I think, there's a lot of progressive candidates running this time, and I think, I think we'll be transferring to each other.
I mean, I imagine
there
will be strong transfer
There's 30
between
candidates, and I hope people will transfer down the ballot.
You'll be voting for one of them.
I vote on the other university panel.
Oh, the Trinity one, yeah. That's even more corrupt than the NUI one, yeah. That's really awful. That's how Shane Ross got into politics. Look at the damage that's done. Anyway, let's go to the front page of the newspapers. We'll start with the front page of the Irish Times. And election pledges at risk from spending time bomb. Also there, Irish obesity rates among the world's worst, and Easter Rising white flag goes up for sale after being rescued from a ship. And a skip. That's even worse. Oh, God. The Irish Examiner, pressure on TDs to back Kenny or Martin. Independents urged to choose as leaders agree to hold talks. And Ireland will lose Apple tax case, warns one expert. And somebody else says no fooling around in drive to cut out speeding. In the Irish Daily Star, first date from hell, jealous ex-husband stabs love rival to death. That's the Irish guy who was killed in Sydney, Australia, I think. And bloody killer then waits for Oz police. And in the Irish Sun, date with death, the same story. And they have a tribute to Ronnie Corbett, who died today at the age of 85. He was a wonderful comedian, along with Ronnie Barker. All right, you've had an opportunity to read the paper, so
yes.
What do you want to focus on?
Well, I think something that's really interesting is if you link actually the Examiner and the Times, you see we have talk about that tomorrow, and our acting Finance Minister Michael Noonan will be going into talks on the economy. He's going to be talking about the economic issues with the independents, and that's going to be back on the agenda. And we also saw that he's looking to take, which is, I think, absolutely necessary when we look to the costs here, that the USC cuts for higher earners might be off the table. I think they absolutely should be off the table. Yeah. It's absolutely clear that we need to be prioritising, from what we're seeing in the Times, we need to be prioritising the expenditure on public services.
The USC cuts for high earners.
That is apparently not now off the table from the Fine Gael side. They are now rolling back on that proposal.
He made some mess of it, didn't he?
Well, I think it was absolutely never a proposal that was feasible or that was long-term. And the other reason it's not long-term is if we look to the case with Apple. Because, of course, the fiscal space that we were hearing about is deeply dependent on corporation tax and windfall tax, which is not secure. So if we are looking to deliver the absolutely reasonable asks we're seeing in terms of investment in our health service and our education service here, in terms of the costs that are coming, and not to mention new services that we need. If we're going to meet our standards on violence against women, if we're going to meet our standards on childcare, we need expenditure. We need to make sure we're guarding our fiscal space. We can't afford higher-end tax cuts. And it also is just a reminder that the world is shifting. Even as we're having these very talks that are going on and on and on, we see that the tax situation is going on. And in the Financial Times, of course, we see as well that the trade agreements between Europe and the US are going ahead. And, of course, TTIP and CETA, these are the negotiations which will not only affect the fiscal space, but the policy space. Those spaces are being constrained as we go on.
Laura, you better get in there.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think in terms of the...
she mightn't give you her number.
In terms of the...
Come on.
In terms of the election pledges from the overspending, I mean, I think that's a key area to look at. I mean, if you look at the overspending in health, the overspending in education, in terms of justice as well, I think it really highlights the need for investment in our public services. You know, we can't have a situation where we're going from government to government and we're having the same problems over and over again.
To fund
and I think, increased progressive
taxes are you in favour of?
Increased progressive taxation. I think if we want to have
income tax, higher income tax.
Yeah, progressively. So you know.
Yeah, so that people earning say 70,000, what proportion of their income do you think should be paid in tax?
Well, I think that's something that needs to be looked at, but I think they need
to
pay
a higher...
You're
running
they need
Senate.
to pay a
Come
higher...
on, looking at it. You're in favour of this, so you must have looked at it. So tell us.
Well, I don't agree that they should be getting, USC cuts compared to somebody who is on, 20,000 wage. And I mean, look, if you look at the third level education, which is highlighted here as well, I mean, there's a report due out on that, the Cassell's report. We have the second highest third level fees, in Europe at the moment as well. And I think a lot of our students are going abroad. They're going to places like Denmark or Scotland or Germany where they can actually study for free, and it's cheaper to live there. It's
Denmark?
Cheaper.
How many Irish people go to Denmark to study?
Well, you can do courses through English there, and it's cheaper. People are starting to look at it as an option.
They're going all over Europe to study.
And Germany,
because you can do English language courses.
Yeah.
And
that's dreadful.
I mean, the housing situation, is another area that I think, we need more investment in. And I think in terms of social housing, and we saw today with the party talks on that. And I think maybe we have to ask ourselves the question. I mean, if the parties can't form a government, are they going to be able to work together on these cross-party issues around housing? And I mean, that comes to the story in the Irish Examiner. With the pressure now on independence to I suppose, back who's going to be the next Taoiseach. And I think the public are, I suppose, a bit...
OK, who would you like to be the next Taoiseach? It's a choice between Micheál Martin and Nick Kenny.
To be honest with you,
who would you opt for?
I think
no messing. Who would you opt for? You have to vote one way or another. Which way would you go?
I think they're much of the same.
No, I'm sorry. Which way would you go?
No,
you have to make decisions. If you're elected to the Senate, you have to make decisions. So show us how you can make decisions right now by telling us which would you opt for.
To be honest with you, I don't think it makes much of a difference between the two of them.
No point in asking somebody.
I don't think it makes...
Electing somebody to the Senate who can't take it.
I don't think it makes a difference between the two of them because they're both conservative, similar parties.
Who would you go for?
Well, I won't be voting though because, of course, I'm running the Shannon, so it doesn't apply at all.
Which one you would wish to be Taoiseach?
I think there's a little bit too much focus on the concept of Taoiseach and the competition over who might be Taoiseach and not. What I want to see is...
Very good, yeah.
What I want to see is that we're looking at...
I'll forget
if we have a minority government...
I won't push you anymore, yeah.
Well, it's
which would you prefer to be Taoiseach? Enda Kenny or Micheál Martin?
What I want to see
No.
I will tell you.
Don't mind about what you want to say. Just tell us.
I'm not one of the independent TDs who are negotiating that. They are the people who have to answer this question. What I need to answer is, I am very happy to be working on the outside in the Shannon with a minority government led by either party.
Absolutely, that's what they do. Politicians come in here night after
night. No, we ask the relevant questions.
One thing they want, and one thing they won't do is answer a question. And some of them say, I'll ask a relevant question, or rather, I'll ask what I think was the I'll answer what I think is the relevant question.
You know what is the right question, which was actually mentioned by Laura, which I think you passed over, and I think it's crucial, is housing. We had a huge forum on housing that happened yesterday. And today, the housing forum, and that did not feature. And when we're talking about long term, it's not a matter of who's in the top job. It is a matter of what the ministries are. Will there be a minister for housing, for example? Is that going to happen?
Any chance you'd answer the question?
I won't answer that question.
Just tell me no if there's no chance if you answer the question, I'll give up. If you say no, I'll give up. Is there any chance you'll answer the question?
No, I'm not going to answer that question.
You know any chance you'll answer?
No. But what
I think that
the two of them are already politicians. They've got the mentality.
I think
not at all.
We need to at the moment what we're talking about is personalities in politics.
It's personality
talking about the issues as opposed to the personalities. I'm more concerned about what policies are going to be on the table.
What I'm interested, I think what we're talking about is what is going to be in the programme. we're talking about the finance ministers, what's going to be in the economic policies, what's going to be dropped in the pledges. I think that's the content that matters. And if we're in the Seanad, we'll be working alongside trying to make sure that we're influencing those policies, that we're shaping them, that we're amending them. I don't think it makes a difference if it is coming through. But no, there's absolutely hope.
There's
still hope.
We're going to go to a break.
It's coming from 1916. There is still hope.
Join us after the break and we'll be in tears. Join us then. We're in even more tears than we expected to be, because there's a woman called Ciara O'Neill, who's chairperson of the 1916 Relatives Association, has sent a letter challenging Donna Cooney's claim that she's the grandniece of Elizabeth O'Farrell, and says that she was asked to provide information, hasn't done so, and all of that. And it's the first item of the agenda of all organisations. It's the spirit. I'll give you the letter. Some of the other texts and tweets. It seems like bending over backwards when people advocate commemorating both the revolutionaries of 1916 and the people who shot them. That's Joan Reynolds saying that. Anthony in Ranelagh says the 1916 commemoration at the GPOs for VIPs only. VIPs? There are VIPs in this country. Who are the VIPs? It is illogical to somebody else. Jason says it's illogical to commemorate your oppressor. The professional soldiers of the empire, whatever nationality, were imperialist soldiers who slaughtered indigenous people worldwide for pay. Who commemorates them? It's so downright wrong-headed, a logic that could not hold up in any area of life or intellect. And Mary Hughes goes on to say candidates should have university qualification in economics and proven common sense before they're allowed to run in the election for the Senate. Proven common sense. OK, we've got to leave it there. That's it for now. For more tonight's programme, log on to tv3.ie. The weather's next month tonight. Good night.